Catherine stood at the threshold, the weight of her worn, traveling bag heavy in her hand. She could feel the wind biting at her cheeks, the chill of the evening creeping through her coat. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the way his voice had broken the silence of the village. Desperation laced each word as David Harper, the farmer, stood before her with his eyes wide, almost pleading. His 6-year-old daughter, Olivia, peered out from behind him, clutching a ragged doll in her small hands. The sight of the child's solemn eyes made Catherine's heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. Catherine hadn't cried in 2 years, not since they lowered her husband John into the cold earth. She had buried him without a sound, unable to mourn, unable to weep. The grief was a heavy blanket, smothering any feeling she might have had. Life had gone on, and she had gone with it, mechanically teaching at the village schoolhouse, living in the rented room above the general store. Every day, she did the work, but her heart remained frozen, far removed from the world around her. But standing on this porch, with David's weary eyes on her and Olivia's quiet gaze tugging at her, she felt something stir. It was a spark, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her question everything. "Just 6 weeks," Catherine said, her voice tight. "That's all I can promise you." David nodded, relief flickering in his expression, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man worn down by the weight of too many responsibilities. His wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth 18 months ago, leaving him to raise Olivia alone. His sister, who had helped with the child and the farm, had left to care for their aging parents. Now he was overwhelmed by the fields that needed tending, the animals that needed feeding, and a grieving little girl who wouldn't speak. The arrangement was simple. Catherine would stay for 6 weeks, just long enough to help with Olivia and keep the house. She didn't expect much, certainly not an emotional connection. She had nothing left to give, and after 6 weeks, she would walk away, just as she always did, keeping her distance from life. As Catherine stepped inside the cottage, her boots heavy against the wooden floor, she couldn't help but take in the sight of the house. It was small, yet sturdy, nestled among the fields with a barn and a vegetable garden that had long since been abandoned to the weeds. There is a sense of quiet decay here, as if the house had been waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. And now, that someone was her. Olivia didn't speak. She merely watched Catherine with wide, grieving eyes, clutching her doll as if it were a lifeline. There was something fragile about the child, something that reminded Catherine of herself when she had lost John. But Catherine pushed the thought away. She wasn't here to mother the girl. She was here to help David, and that's all. David led her to the small guest room where she would sleep, the sheets cold and unwelcoming. As she unpacked her meager belongings, a small object slipped from the folds of her bag. It was John's pocket watch, the one he had always kept with him. She hadn't meant to bring it. She had forgotten it was there. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't cried since his death, not even once. Not for the man she had loved, not for the life they had built together. And yet, as she held the watch in her palm, she could feel the ache of his absence more than ever. But no tears came. The wind outside howled, but Catherine remained still, staring at the pocket watch in her hand. She hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long that she wasn't sure she could anymore. But as she tucked the watch back into the corner of her bag, a thought flickered in her mind. Maybe this would be different. Maybe, for once, the wall she had built around herself would come down. That night, she lay awake in the guest room, the silence of the cottage wrapping around her like a shroud. She could hear Olivia's soft sobs from the next room, the child grieving for a mother she had lost too soon. Catherine wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. She had learned the hard way that when you let people in, they could be taken away. And she wasn't ready for that again. She turned her back to the wall, her thoughts a whirlwind. 6 weeks, she reminded herself. That was all she had to give. No more. She would do her job. Keep the house, cook the meals, help with Olivia, but she would not become attached. Not to this child, not to this life. As Catherine drifted into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside her. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could sense it, an inkling of something that could break through the walls she had so carefully built. But for now, all she could do was sleep and dream of a life that had been lost. The sound of Olivia's crying through the thin walls was the last thing Catherine heard before she closed her eyes. She did not go to comfort the child. The walls were still there between them all. She couldn't cross them. Not yet. Week one passed like a ghost moving through the house. Catherine present, but not truly there. The mornings began with Catherine waking before dawn, her movements efficient but devoid of warmth as she prepared breakfast. David would eat in silence, his gaze distant, and then head out to the fields, leaving her with Olivia, who barely acknowledged her presence. The little girl picked at her food, her eyes always guarded, as if still unsure of this stranger in their home. Catherine's days followed the same pattern: cleaning, mending, cooking, but there was no joy in it. She kept a professional distance, her heart closed off, her mind busy with the tasks at hand. She spoke to Olivia only when necessary, calling her child and never by name, always maintaining that invisible barrier between them. With David, she spoke only about household matters, never crossing that line into anything personal. Meals were eaten quickly, and then Catherine would retreat to her room, her thoughts always on the time she had left. Olivia, meanwhile, remained a mystery, quiet, almost ethereal in her grief. Catherine found some of the child's drawings hidden under the bed while cleaning one day. The sketches were dark, filled with somber figures, a lone chair at a table, a single figure standing in a field, a crossed-out mother. The most telling drawing was one of three people: Papa, Olivia, and a shadowed figure, Catherine herself, but with no face. It unsettled her, yet she didn't allow herself to think too much about it. On Sunday, David insisted they attend church together, and as they sat in the pews, Catherine felt the weight of the village's eyes on them. Widow Thompson whispered to another, her disapproving gaze fixed on Catherine, but the widow's judgment didn't reach her. As the hymn began, Catherine sat stiffly, feeling Olivia shift closer to her side. She instinctively pulled away, unsure of how to react. Then came the incident with Olivia's lamb, which had escaped through the broken fence. Olivia had chased after it, crying out in fear, but when she fell in the mud, Catherine caught the lamb and brought it back to the child. "I thought I lost him like I lost Mama," Olivia sobbed, and for a moment, Catherine's heart softened. She almost comforted the girl, but then she caught herself, her voice cold as she ordered Olivia to wash up. The child's face crumpled in confusion, hurt by the distance Catherine kept. That evening, Catherine scrubbed the floor violently, her anger and frustration spilling out in the harsh strokes. David found her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to be afraid of her," he said softly, but Catherine's defense was quick. "I'm not afraid. I'm doing my job." David's words were quiet but pointed. "Your job isn't to hide from a lonely little girl." The tension between them was thick as Catherine retreated into herself, unable to make sense of the growing ache in her chest. That night, she heard Olivia crying again, her sobs muffled through the walls, but Catherine couldn't bring herself to go to the child. She stood at the door, her hand on the handle, but in the end, she retreated back to her bed, telling herself she couldn't afford to attach to anyone. Not again. The storm that raged outside mirrored the turmoil within her, and as Olivia's terrified scream echoed through the night, "Papa, Papa," Catherine sat up in bed, frozen, torn between the wall she had built around her and the need to protect the child who had already lost so much. The storm raged like Catherine's heart had once raged. Wild, uncontained, terrifying. It tore through the night, the wind howling and lightning flashing in the sky. casting eerie shadows across the cottage. Olivia's screams pierced the chaos, and Catherine's resolve shattered. For a moment, she was frozen, unsure of what to do, but then she bolted out of bed, her feet moving instinctively toward the child's room. She flung open the door to find Olivia thrashing in her bed, her eyes wide with terror, caught in the throes of a nightmare. "Mama, don't leave. Come back," Olivia cried, trapped in a memory that wasn't real, yet so vivid to her. Catherine's heart squeezed at the sound of the child's desperation, and for the first time, she acted without thinking. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps, gathered the sobbing child in her arms, and held her close, rocking her gently, as if she could somehow erase the pain. "Just sweetheart, I'm here. I won't leave," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking the silence, soothing Olivia with the words she didn't realize she needed to say. The child's small hands clung to her, and Catherine stayed, rocking her, until Olivia's cries finally quieted. She didn't know how long it had been, hours, minutes, or perhaps seconds, but she didn't let go. She couldn't. Not now. When morning light finally crept into the room, Catherine was still holding Olivia, the little girl curled in her lap, sound asleep for the first time in what felt like forever. The storm had passed, but Catherine was left with a quiet that seemed almost foreign. She sat still, gazing down at Olivia's peaceful face, wondering what had happened to the wall she had spent so long building. David's footsteps approached, and Catherine looked up just as he entered the room. His gaze softened when he saw them. Catherine, the widow who had become something more in the span of one sleepless night, and Olivia, finally at rest. He didn't say anything at first, simply covered them with a quilt and walked back out without waking them. The gesture was simple, but in that moment, something shifted between them. When Catherine woke, she felt a strange sense of disorientation. She hadn't meant to sleep in the chair, hadn't meant to get so close to Olivia, but there she was, and there was the child, still asleep, her hand resting against Catherine's chest. For a fleeting moment, Catherine considered sneaking away, pretending it never happened, but something inside her tugged at her. She couldn't just leave, not now. Carefully, she moved Olivia to her bed, tucking the little girl in, before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, she found David already making coffee, his back to her as he worked. The silence between them was thick, uncomfortable, and Catherine wasn't sure how to break it. David turned when he heard her footsteps, and their eyes met. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of something, gratitude, maybe, but also an unspoken acknowledgement of the change that had taken place. "She hasn't slept through the night in over a year," he added, his words hanging in the air like a confession. Catherine swallowed, unsure of what to say. "It was just, she needed someone," she replied, the words feeling hollow even to her own ears. "But David wasn't done. She needed you," he said, and for the first time, the weight of his words sank in. It wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just 6 weeks. Something had shifted, and Catherine couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, the distance between them began to close. Catherine no longer maintained the rigid barriers she had once held so tightly to. She started to help Olivia with small tasks, braiding her hair for church, teaching her to knead bread dough, reading her bedtime stories with emotion in her voice. Olivia, in turn, began to open up, her smile returning slowly, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. She laughed again, and the sound of it was like music to Catherine's ears. The house, once cold and lifeless, now felt warm, filled with the sound of the child's joy. Catherine caught herself smiling, something she hadn't done in years. Market day came, and David, Catherine, and Olivia made the trip to the village together. It was the first time Catherine had been to the market since her arrival, and as they walked through the stalls, she found herself caught between 2 worlds. She was no longer just the housekeeper, the stranger in their home. She was part of their world, part of their small family. Olivia reached out to her hand as they passed the fabric merchant's stall, her fingers slipping naturally into Catherine's. The merchant smiled warmly. "Your daughter has your eyes, ma'am," she said, and Catherine flinched at the remark, unsure of how to respond. But Olivia, as if reading her thoughts, corrected the merchant with an innocent smile. "She's not my mama. She's Miss Catherine. But I love her," the child said, and Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't Olivia's mother. She could never be. But in that moment, it felt like something close. She bought Olivia a small ribbon for her hair, something she hadn't done for anyone in years. And when the child looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes, Catherine found herself saying, "Of course, sweetheart," when Olivia asked her to put the ribbon in. That night, after Olivia went to bed, Catherine and David sat by the fire. The evening was quiet, and for the first time they spoke, truly spoke, to each other. David talked about his late wife, Margaret, with a tenderness that made Catherine's heart ache. She was sunshine, everything bright. Losing her was like losing summer forever, David said, his voice heavy with the weight of his memories. Catherine listened, her eyes downcast, unsure of how to respond. But when it was her turn, she found herself speaking too. "My husband was steady, like an oak tree. When he died, I lost my shelter," she said, her voice low, but her words honest. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "How long?" he asked softly. "2 years, and I still haven't cried," Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you're not ready to let go," David said, his words gentle, but his gaze unwavering. Catherine swallowed hard. "Maybe I'm just broken," she muttered, her throat tight. David reached across the table, his hand brushing hers for a brief moment. "Or maybe you just haven't felt safe enough to break," he said quietly. Catherine looked at him, her heart pounding. Something shifted in her chest, like a wall cracking. She realized that she was in danger. She was starting to care. The agreement was supposed to end in 3 weeks, and she had promised herself she would leave before anything could happen. But when she closed her eyes that night, she saw Olivia's smile, and she heard David's gentle voice. She felt something stirring in her heart that she wasn't ready to admit. The next morning, a visitor arrived, a well-dressed woman in a fine carriage. David's face went pale when he saw her. "Grace," he muttered under his breath. Catherine watched from the window as Grace kissed David on the cheek, and Olivia ran out to greet her with excitement in her voice. "Aunt Grace," she called, but when Grace saw Catherine watching from the window, her expression hardened. "So this is the housekeeper I've heard about," Grace said coldly, and Catherine's heart sank. She had no idea what Grace's arrival meant, but she could sense that it would change everything. Grace Hartford stood in the parlor like she owned it, because once, everyone had assumed she would. She was David's former fiancée, the one he had been expected to marry before fate had decided differently. The woman who, according to village gossip, had been waiting in the wings for years, holding on to hope that David would eventually come back to her. Now, with Margaret gone, Grace had come to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Dressed in the finest clothes, her presence filled the room like an overbearing storm cloud, casting its shadow over the small, humble cottage. Catherine felt an instant wave of unease as Grace scanned the room, her sharp eyes appraising everything with a critical gaze. She made no effort to hide her disapproval of the modest surroundings, her voice laced with thinly veiled judgment. "Adequate, I suppose, for temporary help," Grace remarked, as if the cottage should have been grander. Catherine clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to respond. She had seen the way Grace looked at her, as if she were nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience in the way of what Grace thought was hers. As if her own quiet grief and the fragile bond she had begun to form with Olivia and David were just an unimportant chapter to be erased. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed to sense the tension, her little hands clutching Catherine's skirts as she hid behind her. It was clear that Olivia had no interest in the woman who had once been part of David's life. Not when she had Catherine, the woman who had stayed with her through long nights of nightmares and endless grief. Grace, with her polished demeanor and lofty airs, didn't seem to notice the way Olivia clung to Catherine as if she were her true mother. Instead, she tried to engage Olivia, speaking to her in the syrupy tone one might use to address a child they didn't know well. "Olivia, darling, I think it's time you had a proper lady's influence," Grace said, her words dripping with an undertone that made Catherine bristle. "I can take you to my estate, where you'll have the finest tutors and learn all the things a young lady should. Don't you want to become a proper lady?" Olivia, confused and upset, clung tighter to Catherine, her eyes wide and wary. Catherine saw the hurt flicker across the child's face before it was quickly hidden, and in that moment, she knew that Grace's offer wasn't one Olivia wanted. It was a life of opulence and distance, one that didn't offer the comfort of home, warmth, and love. Catherine felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. She wasn't going to let Grace take Olivia away from this family, not after everything they had been through. She couldn't allow it. David, ever the diplomat, tried to handle the situation with Grace, but it was clear that his discomfort with Grace's presence was palpable. "Grace, I appreciate the offer, but I've got this covered," he said, his tone stiff, but his eyes never leaving Catherine. Grace's lips tightened, but she didn't back down. "David, it's been long enough. Margaret wouldn't want Olivia raised by hired help," she said with a cold edge in her voice. "We were meant to be together once. Perhaps this is fate's second chance." Catherine's stomach twisted at the suggestion. Grace wasn't just trying to bring Olivia in her fold. She was trying to pull David back in her life, to take him away from what they had built. "I can provide for Olivia. Give her opportunities. And you need a proper wife," Grace pressed, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between David and Catherine. Catherine could feel the weight of Grace's words, and for a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Grace wasn't just a threat to Olivia's place in this house. She was a reminder of what Catherine had been avoiding, of the life she had almost lost. David didn't answer immediately, his mind obviously in turmoil, but Catherine could see that he wasn't ready to let go of what they had. He wasn't ready to let go of her. "Think about it. I'll return in a week for your answer," Grace said, her tone final. The moment she left, Catherine felt the air in the room grow still and heavy, as though the storm outside had found its way in. She retreated to her room, her heart racing. Olivia had followed her, her little face flushed with the fear that Catherine couldn't shake. "Miss Catherine, are you going to leave us?" Olivia asked, her voice small and broken. Catherine knelt down to the girl, taking her small hands in hers. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere," Catherine assured her, though her own heart felt like it was cracking under the weight of the truth. She didn't want to leave. She had never wanted to leave. But the truth was, she had never allowed herself to get this close to anyone before. She couldn't afford to stay, not when she knew that losing them would break her beyond repair. Olivia's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "You promised you wouldn't leave. You said you'd stay," she whispered, her words echoing Catherine's deepest fears. Catherine bit her lip, fighting the urge to pull the child into her arms and promise that she would never go. But she couldn't make that promise. She wasn't ready to let herself feel again, not with the pain of losing someone still so fresh in her mind. As Catherine packed her bag later that evening, she felt a sickening sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She had convinced herself that this was the right decision, that leaving would keep her from further heartbreak. But the more she packed, the heavier her heart became. She wasn't just leaving the house. She was leaving them. She was leaving David. She was leaving Olivia. The guilt gnawed at her insides, but still, she didn't turn back. She was about to walk away from everything she had grown to care for when David found her in the hallway. His face was a mixture of confusion, hurt, and anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. Catherine stopped, her bag still half-packed. "I'm leaving. It's time," she said, trying to sound firm. though her voice trembled. David's expression darkened. "Before anyone gets hurt?" he asked bitterly. "Olivia's already hurt. She's outside sobbing because she thinks you're leaving her." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She hadn't realized how deeply she had already become embedded in Olivia's heart. "She'll forget me." "Children are resilient," Catherine said, though she knew it wasn't true. David's frustration grew. "Is that what you tell yourself? That loss doesn't matter if you don't acknowledge it." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Then make me understand, Catherine. Why are you running?" Catherine's walls were starting to crumble, and for the first time, she didn't know how to hide the truth anymore. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out in a broken whisper. "Because everyone I love dies, David. I love my husband. He died because I asked him to help someone. And now, I'm terrified of loving anyone else because I can't lose anyone again." Her voice faltered, but she didn't stop. "I haven't cried since John died. I can't. I can't feel not like this. Not again." David stood still for a long moment, his eyes softening as he stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "You think you're broken? You held my daughter through a storm. You taught her to laugh again. You brought life back to this house." He touched her hand gently. "That's not broken, Catherine. That's brave." For a moment, Catherine couldn't speak. She wanted to say something, to explain, but her emotions were tangled. He was right. She had helped Olivia. She had become part of their lives without even realizing it. She had already allowed herself to care. And it terrified her. "I don't want Grace," David said quietly, his voice full of certainty. "I don't want anyone else." And then, in a voice so soft, it almost seemed like a prayer, he whispered, "Please don't leave." The words hit Catherine like a tidal wave, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt the walls inside her crumble. But she wasn't sure she could trust herself, wasn't sure she could stay. She looked away, trying to steady her breathing. "I need air. I need to think," she said, stepping away, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to lose. David stood there, watching her leave, his face a mixture of hope and despair. And Catherine knew she was making a choice she might never be able to take back. The sun was setting when David realized Olivia's doll was missing. Then her coat. Then Olivia herself. Panic flooded his chest as he searched the house, calling her name in the growing darkness, his voice rising with urgency. But there was no answer, only the haunting silence of the empty rooms. Catherine, still lost in her own thoughts as she returned from her evening walk, was the first to hear David's frantic calls. When she entered the cottage, she found him pacing back and forth, his face pale with fear. "Olivia's gone," he said, his voice shaking as he grabbed Catherine's arm. The realization hit her like a brick to the chest, and the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. She was already running before he finished the sentence, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean gone?" Catherine asked, her breath coming in short gasps, her mind reeling with the possibility that something terrible had happened. David barely spared her a glance before he ran to the door, shouting for the men in the village to help search. Catherine didn't wait for the search party. She went straight to Olivia's room, her hands trembling as she opened the door. The room was eerily still, and that's when she saw it. A small scrap of paper crumpled in a corner. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but it was unmistakable. "Gonna find Mama. Don tell Miss Catherine. She leaves anyway." Catherine's heart stopped. She showed the note to David, her voice hollow as she said, "She thinks I'm leaving." His face crumpled, and for the first time, he looked utterly defeated. "Where would she go?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She told me once. There's a place by the creek where her mother used to take her to pick wildflowers," Catherine replied, her voice thick with emotion. "She said it's where she feels closest to her mama." David's face tightened with concern. "That's 2 miles through woods, in the dark." Catherine didn't hesitate. Without another word, she grabbed a lantern, and the two of them set off into the night, their footsteps heavy on the ground, their minds racing with fear. The village was a distant memory as they entered the dark woods, the wind howling around them. The only sound was the crackle of leaves underfoot, the flickering of a lantern, and the distant rustling of branches swaying in the storm's aftermath. Catherine called Olivia's name repeatedly, her voice raw with fear, but there was no answer. The woods seemed endless, and the darkness wrapped around them like a thick, suffocating blanket. Catherine's mind raced with thoughts of Olivia. Was she hurt? Lost? Alone? She could barely breathe with the weight of her own terror pressing down on her chest. Not again, she thought, her heart breaking all over again. She couldn't lose this child. She couldn't let another person slip through her fingers. As the night grew colder, they pressed on, their search growing more frantic with every step. The minutes felt like hours, the dark trees seeming to close in around them as they moved deeper into the woods. Catherine's legs burned, but she didn't stop, didn't even think about stopping. She had to find Olivia. She had to fix this. Just when she thought she might collapse, she heard it, the faint sound of crying. Her heart leaped, and she signaled to David to follow her as she hurried toward the sound. They found her near the creek, huddled under a tree, her small body trembling with cold and fear. Olivia was clutching the ragged doll to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at Catherine as if seeing her for the first time, her wide eyes full of confusion and hurt. "I wanted to see Mama," Olivia whispered through her sobs. "I wanted to ask her why everyone leaves. Why doesn't anyone stay?" Catherine's throat tightened as she knelt down beside the child. For the first time since arriving, she didn't try to keep her distance. She didn't hold back. She wrapped her arms around Olivia, pulling her close, feeling the little body shudder in her arms. "Olivia," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I promise you, I'm not leaving." Olivia sobbed into her chest, her tiny body shaking with the weight of her emotions. "But you don't love us," she choked out. "You can't even cry." Catherine's heart shattered at the words, but she didn't pull away. She held the child tighter, feeling the floodgates of her own grief burst open. She had been so afraid to feel, so terrified of losing anyone again. But now, with Olivia in her arms, she understood something that she had never allowed herself to see. This is love, she realized. This is what it means to care. The tears that Catherine had denied for so long came flooding out, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to cry. She cried for John, for the life they could have had, for the years of grief that had kept her locked away from everything and everyone. But most of all, she cried for Olivia, because the little girl who had lost so much deserved more than the walls Catherine had built around her heart. David knelt down beside them, his hands reaching out to wrap around both of them. Olivia's sobs slowly quieted as Catherine continued to hold her, the comfort of her presence slowly bringing the child back from the edge of her fear. "Olivia," Catherine whispered, wiping the child's tears away, "I love you. I love you so much it terrifies me. But I'm here. I'm not leaving." David's voice was thick with emotion as he wrapped his coat around them both. "We love you too, Catherine," he said softly, his voice breaking as he spoke. Not as a housekeeper, not as temporary help. He looked down at Olivia, who was now snuggled in his arms, and then back at Catherine. "We need you as family." Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been so afraid to admit it, so afraid to let herself feel again. But here they were, all three of them, standing together in the dark, bound by something stronger than fear. She didn't have to run. She didn't have to keep hiding. She had a family now. She had a place in this world. As they walked back to the cottage, Olivia held onto Catherine's hand, her small fingers wrapping around Catherine's like she had always been meant to be there. David walked beside them, his arm around both of them. And for the first time in a long while, Catherine felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear or grief. It was hope. When they returned to the cottage, The village men, who had been searching the area, were already waiting, their faces relieved as they saw the three of them walking back together. Catherine carried Olivia upstairs and tucked her into bed, the little girl's tired eyes closing as she murmured, "Will you be here when I wake up?" "I'll be here," Catherine whispered, brushing the hair from Olivia's face. "I promise." Olivia's voice was barely audible as she drifted off to sleep. "Forever?" she asked. Catherine's heart ached with love as she kissed the child's forehead. "Forever," she whispered, as she stood by the bed. Watching Olivia sleep peacefully, Catherine's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the ache of loss, it was the warmth of healing. She was finally letting herself heal. Downstairs, David stood waiting by the fire, his eyes soft as he looked at her. They didn't need words. The bond between them was stronger than anything that needed to be said. Catherine walked toward him, and he opened his arms. This time, she didn't hesitate. She stepped into his embrace, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself be held, letting the tears fall freely, tears of grief, of love, of relief. It was the first time in so long that she felt truly alive. And as she stood in David's arms, surrounded by warmth and safety, she knew that this was home. 6 months had passed since the night Catherine's tears finally fell, and with them, the walls around her heart had crumbled completely. The house, once cold and empty, was now filled with the warmth of life, laughter, and love. Catherine had changed, more than she could have ever imagined. She was no longer just the widow who had come to help. She had become part of the fabric of the Harper family, woven in with love, joy, and the promise of something better. The one-star cottage was now filled with the touch of her hands. Her curtains, the ones she had sewn with Olivia's help, hung in every window. The garden, which had once been overtaken by weeds, was now a flourishing patchwork of vegetables, flowers, and fruit. And in the pantry, jars of preserves, canned with love, lined the shelves, a testament to her care for this home and the life she was building. Olivia, who had once clung to her with suspicion and fear, now called her Mama Catherine without hesitation, her voice full of affection and familiarity. The change in the little girl was remarkable. She was no longer the quiet, withdrawn child who had once retreated into herself, lost in grief. Now, she was the picture of joy, running through the fields with the wind in her hair, laughing as she played. She had blossomed under Catherine's care, her once lonely heart now full of the love that Catherine had feared she could never give. And David was the steady rock, the anchor in the storm that Catherine had always needed. His love for her was evident in every small gesture, every meal they shared, every quiet moment they spent together, every time he held her close after a long day. He had never pushed her to be someone she wasn't. Instead, he had allowed her to be herself, to heal at her own pace. Their mornings had become a quiet ritual, one filled with routine, but also a sense of comfort. Catherine and Olivia would wake early, the smell of fresh bread filling the house as they prepared breakfast together. David would return from his morning chores, the light of the day catching the lines on his face, and they would share a meal, the three of them laughing and talking like a real family. It was simple, but it was perfect, and every day, Catherine felt more and more at home. The nights were no different. After Olivia went to bed, Catherine and David would sit by the fire, their conversations flowing easily, sometimes about the day's events, sometimes about things they had never spoken about before. They had learned to talk, really talk, and in those moments, Catherine found herself falling deeper in love with a man who had patiently waited for her to heal. It wasn't just about what they had lost. It was about what they had found in each other. Catherine had once thought that she would never be able to love again, that her heart was too broken, too shattered by grief. But she had been wrong. Love didn't mean replacing what had been lost. It meant finding new ways to love, new ways to heal. It meant opening her heart to those who needed her and allowing herself to be needed in return. One morning, as they sat around the breakfast table, Olivia turned to David, her eyes bright with excitement. "Papa, can Mama Catherine come to the Harvest Festival with us this year?" she asked eagerly. David smiled and reached across the table to take Catherine's hand, his fingers warm against her skin. "Of course," he said, his voice full of tenderness. "We'll all go together." Olivia beamed, her face lighting up with joy. "As a family," she said, and the words rang in Catherine's heart like a sweet melody. It was the first time Olivia had said it so simply, so naturally. She hadn't just accepted Catherine into their lives. She had embraced her as part of the family. The thought brought tears to Catherine's eyes. A few days later, they made the trip to the village for the Harvest Festival, the whole family together. The air was crisp, the trees bursting with color, and as they walked through the village, Catherine felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Olivia held her hand, her small fingers wrapped around Catherine's like a promise, and David walked beside them, his arm brushing against hers. It wasn't just the festival, it was the way the world seemed to open up before them, the way they moved through life together as a family. Catherine had never thought she would experience something like this again. But here she was, surrounded by the people she loved, living a life that felt fuller than anything she had ever known. As they walked through the festival, they stopped at the stall with wildflowers. Olivia eagerly picked a bouquet, and Catherine watched her, a smile on her lips. "These are like the ones Mama Margaret loved," Olivia said, holding the flowers up to Catherine. There was no sadness in her voice, just a simple acknowledgement of the past. Catherine smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Should we pick some for the table?" she asked. Olivia nodded enthusiastically. "Can we put some on Mama's grave too?" she asked. Catherine's heart ached, but she nodded. "That's a beautiful idea, sweetheart." They continued through the festival, the day filled with laughter, music, and food. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. The moments when Catherine looked at David and saw the same love reflected in his eyes that she felt in her heart. It was the way he reached for her hand without thinking, the way he looked at her with such tenderness that it made her feel safe. After the festival, they made their way to the village cemetery, where Margaret and John's graves stood side by side. Olivia placed the wildflowers on her mother's grave, her small hands gently arranging them as she whispered a quiet prayer. Then she turned to Catherine and took her hand. "Mama Catherine," she said softly, her voice full of innocence, "will you put some flowers on Papa's grave too?" Catherine's heart swelled with love as she nodded and gently placed the flowers on John's grave. She didn't know how long she stood there, but it didn't matter. The past wasn't something that could be erased, but it was something that could be honored. "Thank you, John," Catherine whispered to the grave, her voice trembling, "for teaching me what love was. I'll always carry you with me." She turned to Margaret's grave. "And thank you, Margaret, for these two beautiful souls. I promise to love them well." Olivia took her hand, her little fingers wrapped around Catherine's, and for the first time in a long time, Catherine felt at peace. She wasn't just honoring the past. She was building a future. As they walked away from the graves, David turned to Catherine and spoke in a low voice. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You've come so far." Catherine looked at him, her heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "You've helped me heal." David smiled, his eyes full of warmth and affection. "We've helped each other," he said. And it was true. They had. A few days later, Grace returned, as promised, to collect David's answer. She found Catherine teaching Olivia to play the piano, her fingers gently guiding the child's hands over the keys. When she saw the three of them together, David, Catherine, and Olivia, something shifted in Grace's eyes. There was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet sadness. "I came for your answer," Grace said softly, her voice tinged with something that wasn't quite regret, but something close. David turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Catherine already gave it, Grace," he said gently. Grace nodded, her eyes briefly meeting Catherine's. There was no malice in her gaze, only a quiet acceptance of what had transpired. "You love them," she said quietly. "With everything I am," Catherine replied, her voice steady. Grace looked at them one last time, then turned and left without another word. The door closed behind her, but the weight of that chapter in their lives was finally over. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple gold ring, his grandmother's. He looked at Catherine with a tenderness that made her heart race. "Catherine, I have something to ask you," he said quietly. He got down on one knee, and Catherine's breath caught her throat. "I know we've only been together 6 months," he said. "I know we both carry ghosts we'll never fully let go of. But I also know that every morning I wake up grateful you're here. Every night I fall asleep knowing you're under this roof. And I don't want to imagine a day without you in it." He took her hand, and his voice softened. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Olivia's mother? Will you stay, not for 6 weeks, but for all the weeks we're given?" Catherine's heart swelled, and as tears welled up in her eyes, she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." David slid the ring on her finger, and as he stood, he pulled her into his arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that sealed their promise. Olivia appeared in the doorway, her face full of excitement and joy. "Does this mean Mama Catherine is staying forever?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. Catherine laughed through her tears, pulling the child into her arms. "Forever and ever, sweetheart," she said, her heart full. "We're a real family now." Olivia squealed with delight, and for the first time, Catherine felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. A simple ceremony followed in the village church, with Olivia proudly standing as the flower girl. Catherine and David exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and support each other through all the days ahead. The village celebrated, and even Widow Thompson, who had once disapproved of their arrangement, admitted they were perfect together. A year later, Catherine sat in a rocking chair, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, while Olivia read aloud to her unborn sibling. David was outside, finishing the new room addition to their growing home. The garden outside was in full bloom, wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Catherine's tears fell freely, but these were good tears, tears of joy, of a love she never thought she would find again. Olivia looked up from her book. "Mama, are you crying again?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "Happy tears, love," Catherine replied, her voice soft. "The very best kind." David came inside and kissed her on the forehead. "Any regrets about staying?" he asked gently. Catherine looked around at the life they had built together, the home, the love, the family. "Not a single one," she said, her heart full. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." As she leaned back in her chair, surrounded by her family, Catherine realized that the story wasn't over. The best chapter was still waiting to be written, and it was a story of love, healing, and forever.